It's my pleasure to welcome you to this, which is our final session of Ideas Festival on Culture and Identity. Coleman Domingo, who was meant to be with us, fell ill in New York. Nothing serious, he just wasn't able to fly. So instead, we're actually going to focus incredibly narrowly, which I'm thrilled to do with my friend Sarah Lewis. Sarah and I have been friends for a few years and have orbited the same questions. And when we were making this track on culture and identity, she was completely in the thick of creating what I consider to be an absolute masterpiece, which is the Aperture current issue entitled Vision and Justice, which she was the guest editor of. It's my pleasure to have you with us here to talk about the work that led to this edition of Aperture, focusing on the African American experience through photography, but it's so much more than that. And I can give you a quick bio. We all have bios you can read, but Sarah's currently just starting at Harvard as an assistant professor, which she'll tell us about the work she'll be doing there. She's previously been a curator at MoMA and at the Tate Gallery. She's the author of The Rise, Creativity, The Gift of Failure, and the Search for Mastery. She is a juggernaut of many forceful activities. And I look to you, Sarah, for guidance in so many ways, actually, and I'm looking forward to exploring this. We're going to actually look at a lot of the art and the words that she chose and why. So welcome.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Damian, for having me, and thank you all for coming to what yes, it is, to what I hope will be a conversation about art and citizenship. And I encourage you, and I'm eager to hear your questions about this issue that we'll discuss. I don't know if we're ready to start showing a few of the images, and let me adjust.
Just in a few seconds.
A few seconds from now.
Funny.
Okay.
Does it sound okay? Yeah.
Yeah, you sound good.
Yeah. So this issue of Aperture, Vision and Justice, I said to Damian in the beginning, might embarrass you a bit, because as I was asked to edit this issue, the request was to focus on African American photography, but I thought that request was just too large and too much of a corrective move. Aperture is a foundation that's really the preeminent organization for the field of photography, but hasn't done a great deal with artists of color, and they're forthcoming about that. So this issue was meant to offer a corrective. But instead, I was interested more in really why it is that why pictures have such force, particularly now as we look at the end of the Obama presidency, and we're also in the thick of dealing with activism that's so visible through Black Lives Matter movement and others. And I instead wanted to think about the way in which pictures have often shifted our notions of citizenship as it relates to race. But the reason why you've inspired this is because you got me to think about art and citizenship through much of your work via Aspen. And I really thank you for that. So.
Well, that is entirely undeserved.
It's very true.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
So you mentioned two things. So I just by way of framing this, it's titled Vision and Justice. So maybe you could just give us your thoughts on why you titled it that, what the framework is. And then you also already mentioned in this particular moment, this final year of the Obama presidency and all the other issues of the day that bear on the questions that you're exploring.
Yes. And where's my little clicker here?
It's right here.
Okay.
I have it.
Thank you. So vision and justice. Why vision and justice as opposed to, say, images and justice or art and justice? Well, this is in part inspired by this idea, this framework is inspired by this long ignored scholarship that Frederick Douglass pioneered, in fact. Frederick Douglass during the Civil War surprised his American audiences when he delivered this speech entitled Pictures and Progress. And his argument in this speech was that combat wouldn't be what would recreate the American Union, but instead would be the force of something as seemingly insignificant as a picture. His argument was that there was a sense of, there was a force that these pictures had. He thought they created in us what he called thought pictures, right? He thought that dynamic, the ability to have your vision of the world shifted through an image, was so powerful that nothing else could match it, right? This is the beginning of the picture age.
Exactly, so that possibility that so many people could be exposed to the same image. And did he think that would be a unifying force?
He thought it would be a force for criticality. He thought it would be a force to get us to actually have a new vision for ourselves.
I see.
It's interesting because we're in a parallel moment right now. There was a sense of a new, well, unprecedented level of saturation via pictures when he was giving that speech. But we're in a similar moment because of the way in which technology has spread images around us and has created anything, it can create anything as a picture, right, and deliver it to us as a picture. So I was interested in, the word vision came up because of how Douglass really got me to frame the dynamic of how pictures impact us. I realized it wasn't an argument about the power of one photographer's work or kind of privileging the role of an artist via anyone else, but instead was about our collective work here as we engage with pictures and how our vision shifts as a result. So that's the reason for the title.
I see.
Yeah.
And so I want to also put the overall rubric on this discussion today about storytelling.
Yes.
So I titled this The Real Story because it seems to me that in that quest for a vision, you're actually trying to make sure to represent the full nature and the full scale of humanity.
That's exactly it.
And that is, in fact, what we want to say, telling the real story. But that's a process that it's so painstaking and detailed. So that's I feel really lucky we get to actually walk through this with you because process.
No, that's exactly right, and I'm glad you brought that up. And I asked for the clicker so that I could show them a few of the images that relate to this idea of how it is that you shift a cultural narrative through stories. So this is one of the two covers. This is the Avedon image of Martin Luther King, his father, and one of his sons, which I think is just so masterfully composed, right? For many reasons. The shoulders sort of bookending the two below, suggesting that he's hovering over like the past and the future. I'm going to take us into art history class here.
Yes, yes.
And the sense of also that intense gaze, right, out towards us, I think was also why it felt synoptic with the title, Vision and Justice. But I didn't feel that this could be the only cover for this issue because it's uncharacteristically historic. I mean, Aperture is known for contemporary photography. And here I was introducing readers to Frederick Douglass's work and others. So I wanted to have something that was more contemporary too. So I chose this image by Awal Rezku. He's a former student of mine actually from Yale School of Art where I taught prior to going to Harvard. And he created a series of images of portraits for Vogue magazine actually, documenting the Afro-Punk Festival in Brooklyn. And he has this incredible series, but this I thought sort of captured a sort of forceful self-presentation that defied many cultural narratives, and I thought the two together would be powerful. But I wanted to start to show, well, you can get a sense of the contributors here that I thought would create the full stories that we needed to show the kind of full humanity of African American life. So you have a range of figures, of course, not all of whom are African American deliberately, from scholars like Robin Kelsey, who's the Dean of the Arts at Harvard, and Khalil Muhammad, who is formerly head of the Schomburg and now up at Harvard too. I guess we're taking everybody. And Skip Gates and Jason Moran, other musicians, Wynton Marsalis, John Stauffer, Hank Willis Thomas, Selmy Shatillett, and a range of artists who represent many different traditions in the field of photography, from Devin Allen, Dawood Bey, Awal Rezku. You can see the list here, through to Deborah Willis. But we began the issue with this idea of shifting our notion of the story about African American life and American life by focusing on Douglass, who was the most photographed American man in the 19th century. Right? So
By design?
By design. He deliberately wanted to be in front of the camera as much as possible because at the time he was dealing with what Skip Gates would call the sort of Niagara flow of stereotypical images of African Americans, the caricatures, right? And he understood that his very image could counteract that. This is so much of the corrective move of photography, and it's why it's important to understand the history of it. When he gave this speech, he was also, at the time, the American School of Ethnology was using pictures and photographs to try to prove polygenesis, to try to prove that African Americans were a different species, right? So here he was asserting the exact opposite through self-possession and dignity and honor, ultimately. So he was the most photographed American man, and he, Skip says here, of course, would be drawn to this technology. Here I'm showing you an image of his study and the last home in which he lived, where you can see the sort of bookshelves and images, and then to the left, this window that looked out onto this cabin that he recreated in the back of the home to replicate the slave quarters where he was born, so that he would not forget the distance that he traveled. He was really instantiating kind of through images and pictures in his own life, a way to understand his journey. But he wrote this speech 3 different times over the course of his life, trying to understand the role of pictures. And he poignantly says at one moment in the speech, it might take a century or more for us to understand the impact of this technology, of this in our lives. So I hope we're continuing to do that work. So I'll end it there.
The process of photography in his time was obviously not what it is today.
Very different.
And I think that's a really interesting topic just in general when we think about the availability of imagery. There's the 2 sides of it, the creation and then also the proliferation.
That's right.
Did he, as the most photographed man of his time, did he develop? It's like he helped photography along, is what I think.
Absolutely. He did also take photographs. I was
about to ask.
I was looking at some of his accounting records and saw that. I don't think they've been located. But no, you're right. It is a different moment, but one thing that's similar is that there's a level of democratization about the availability of pictures that was resonant then and is, I think, increased now. In his speech, he talked about how now anyone could have a portrait of themselves, and what that meant for citizenship he thought was enormous. And it seems so small, but remember at the time when you wanted to communicate with someone, you would often send them a picture of yourself, right? This was, yes, people would send letters and things too, but even the power of being able to present yourself and have a kind of self-directedness about that, a level of agency about that.
A definition as well. This is me.
Exactly.
This is who I am.
Precisely.
But then that's being matched in the Douglass scenario with corrective, balancing, which we see with, as Thelma writes about Van der Zee as well, which I'm sure we'll get to.
We'll get to. So Thelma Golden's piece ends the issue. The director of the Studio Museum in Harlem looking at James Van der Zee's photographs, and he's, I think, he's a great exponent of looking at the force of this corrective move for the power of portrait photography in particular, right?
I think, just to frame it in terms of the conversation we've been having over the last week about identity and culture, we've seen that in a number of ways, but I'm thinking about Jose Antonio Vargas's project, Emerging Us, right now, which essentially is a video version of the corrective of who we are in society today, asking people to define themselves or to defy defining themselves. To actually make a corrective.
No, that's a great point. I hadn't thought about the relationship between these two, but I should say from the start, one of the reasons why I felt that this was an urgent topic relates to this idea. If you look at so much of what sociologists tell us about how we are living today versus how we did, say, even 30 years ago, what they'll tell you is, what the data shows is that we're living increasingly in like-minded communities, right? Amongst people who vote like us, have the same religion, often same race. And what does that mean then for how we connect with those unlike us? I think it puts greater onus on video, on pictures, on media of all kinds to bridge that gulf. So it made me think back, of course, to Douglass, because he understood this from the start. But I think we now, as citizens, even if we're not in the art world, don't even love pictures or any of these media, living out, I think, the promise, but also the urgency of his point.
Shall we look a little more?
Yeah, let's do. So I'll take you through a little bit more of the issue, if you like. This Benedict Fernandez image is actually in Harvard's collection at the Harvard Art Museums. I'll be teaching a course at Harvard and a related exhibition that opens in August, which will feature this image for the first time in the collection. There's so many images they've never shown. And it's taken right after Martin Luther King was assassinated, and in Central Park in New York. And here you see these young men having covered their torsos with images from the buttons for the Poor People's Campaign. But what I find so striking about it is it's not just wearing a button on your jacket. It's as if they're kind of laying out the body of King on their own. Buttons covering the zippers, for example, of the jacket, as if it's his life that they're making primary, not their own. I find it to be a very, very powerful image. So this accompanies my editor's note in the piece, which I argue this, which I've said before. we have some great, maybe I can read this. We have some sort of opening sections of the issue. And this one here, I'm showing you is an image by Frank Stewart called Calling the Indians Out from 1976. And this was selected by Wynton Marsalis, who owns this image, and Frank is the photographer for Jazz Lincoln Center. Wynton had a beautiful short piece about it, which I'll read to you now. He said, as dreams of previous generations erode, there's nothing more uplifting than the clear vision of a veteran free of bitterness. This is why I love the work of Frank Stewart. His vigilant eye is trained on counter-narrative realities that run deeper than race, gender, class, or even oppression itself. Frank loves Black folks, but he focuses on timeless human fundamentals that only increase in value and intensity with time. He goes on to describe how he's a jazzman with a camera, and here he starts to talk about the picture. He says this title, Calling the Indians Out, means to proclaim your identity, to invoke ancestors, to prepare the way for the big chief of Mardi Gras Day, and above all else, to combat the demons of life with a razor-sharp artistry. And here they are on a typical Crescent City street, beating out that 3-beat rhythm on those tambourines. Everyone chanting two-way, pocky-way. And then each takes a turn inventing some rhymed couplets, a communal art as old as Dan Tucker. I come from the bottom of the lower ninth, look the devil in his face and say, I don't mind dying. Here they are gathered in that unforced circle, and they clap and dance. And I bet somebody we don't see is hitting a cowbell or a drum. And I hope you're not in a hurry, because we're going to be here until it feels right. Ain't nobody in a hurry. If you've had a bad time for a few centuries, having a great time for a few hours could easily be a matter of life or death.
Wow, Wynton.
Yeah. So there's this image, and Frank is actually one of the first, the last photographer's work I was able to acquire at MoMA before I left. So there are many images like this that will also bring a tear to the eye. This is an image of the late Frike Gebresus, who was Elizabeth Alexander's husband. This is an image that Alicia Hall Moran chose. I asked musicians to engage with the idea of performance and photography. And here you're looking at this Coptic Orthodox church, this Christian ceremony, and he's capturing this moment that would have otherwise maybe been unknown, but for Alicia, it was so powerful that it's become an image in the hearth of her home. James Baldwin, beyond Douglass, is another framing kind of force for this issue. Yesterday, when I was speaking with, or 2 days ago with Chris Jackson, I referenced that essay, The Creative Process, and that's one of the reasons for including his image in this issue. He really understood the kind of lover's quarrel that artists have with their society, and the way in which they use their own images to agitate and to get us to see the world anew. And this is the quote that I so love that I read yesterday. There are forever swamps to be drained, cities to be created, minds to be explored, children to be fed. But the conquest of the physical world is not man's only duty. He's also enjoined to conquer the great wilderness of himself. The precise role of the artist, then, is to illuminate that darkness, blaze roads through vast forests so that we will not, in all our doing, lose sight of its purpose, which is, after all, to make the world a more human dwelling place.
The long project.
And the long project, indeed. I can cycle through. So the issue really is chronological. It goes from Douglass to the current day. So here we're looking at a moment in New York, which was incredibly powerful in the 68, when the Metropolitan Museum mounted a show called Harlem on My Mind. And at the time, there was such division in the city, there still really is, that they included what shocked me and still does, a closed-circuit, two-way television camera that was showing pedestrians on 125th Street to those museum goers and the Met, right? That was a sense of distance at the time between these communities. Foreign land. So this was the moment, though, in which James Van Der Zee was discovered and sort of rediscovered. So it goes through and shows incredible images that I think often, this is a Ken Beckles image from '78 that people don't see often enough. It kind of restores, I think, some of the power of these long-forgotten photographers. Carla Williams has an essay that reminds us of the few outlets that these photographers had for their work. She's looking at the Black Photographers Annual that was published in the 70s when places like Aperture weren't publishing works by photographers of many colors, not only African American. And it also includes not only images, but photographs, but cinema. One of the most exciting parts of editing the issue was working with this transcript between Ava DuVernay and Bradford Young. I asked them to speak about their work.
Well, call that out for a minute. I read that several times. And,
You did.
You know, one thing that I kept coming back to was Ava DuVernay saying that images can nourish us and they can malnourish us. And I kept thinking about that and thinking about the images that we consume on a daily basis and what that says about us and what that puts into us. And it has analogies to a lot of other things about the things we read, the art we seek out, long form, short form, the food we eat. Alice Waters talks a lot about that. And I imagine that that must have been, if not front of mind, back of mind, that you were feeding an audience with this issue.
No, you're exactly right. I was thinking about the role of just nourishment and consumption, right, in this. Because I think to be a global citizen today, you do have to be mindful of what it is that you consume in this daily diet of images that, you know, saturates our world, right? I hope people are seeking out ways of looking at a particular event such that they're seeing it radially, right? And not through maybe one virally disseminated image that only shows one side, right? So the work of an Ava DuVernay or other incredible cinematographers or directors like Ryan Coogler or others are offering a sense of these other sides such that our consumption is a bit healthier in a way. So Ava and Bradford were speaking about their work together in Selma, and this is Ava speaking with Bradford here. If you don't know Bradford Young, he's one of the few, very few African-American cinematographers working today. And is just a force, and was one of the many filmmakers and directors taught by Haile Gerima, who's really at the headwaters, in a sense, of much of American cinema. He taught at Howard for many years. But this is maybe getting to your point too. Ava's quote here is, I think, speaks to this idea of nourishment. We use the term our mind's eye for a reason. These images that we consume, they become part of our DNA. They become a part of our mind, our memory. It's very much what Douglass was saying too. So we continue with the cinema section, and then we get to our current day. How could you not engage with the idea of photography in the Obama presidency with an issue like this? Marie Spurgeon wrote a beautiful piece in which she said, looking at the tension in the presentation of the presidency, the desire to control it a bit more than in other presidencies. But I wanted to just include the spread here. Because one of the animated reasons for doing this portfolio was because of the force of that image. Do you know this shot of the young boy, this is from 2009, who wanted to know if his hair felt exactly like the president's hair, you know. So Obama allowed him to touch his hair. And the power of, and the affirmation of your own image at that young stage, I think is so strong.
So interesting when I think many of us probably can't help but think when the photographs defining a presidency, the parallels to President Kennedy's photographic legacy, which was so carefully sculpted in many different ways.
Yeah.
But you know, when I look at that, first of all, the photo in the rain, which I remember so vividly, as such a moment of the strength and the hope and all of the things that kind of encapsulated in that. And then to see it realized in a sensitive way, and I'll let you go on. But.
No. This. It is. It does show the full range here, and I should say this is Damian Winter's 2008 image, which everyone so loves. But the sensitivity here is sort of mirrored, I think, also in this image, which I would have loved to include. It's one of my favorites. This is an image of Obama writing a note for the kindergartner who was worried that she would get in trouble for missing a day of school for visiting Obama with her parents, who were there with the veterans group. And here, of course, you see Washington in the background. You see her here looking so intently, making sure he's getting that letter just right. And the concentration on his face, I think, just is almost inexpressibly powerful, I think. So you could do an entire issue on the presidency alone and this topic, and the shift in our notions of citizenship through his presidency. Yeah, but of course we have images of the campaign as well. I actually just wrote a piece for a book coming out on St. Martin's Press that's looking at the representation of Michelle Obama. It's coming out in January. Because that's also what animated this project too, looking at the way in which we as a nation had to grapple with our sense of stereotype, ultimately, through the description of her own body, right? Through
Yes.
the campaign. So, he, I think, summarizes it beautifully. It's impossible to underestimate the symbolic importance of these myriad photographs of President Obama. And this is a Nona Faustine image where has emblematized that sense of hope with this newborn child on the day of, I think, the inauguration here. And I of course, love the power of this shot to include. Carrie Mae Weems. So Carrie Mae Weems is a MacArthur-winning, incredible photographer who created this body of work called the Kitchen Table Series 30 years ago. That was one of the first times where you got a sense of interiority of a Black female subject in photographs. And she has this series in which she's looking at this engagement with her lover, with friends who come over to support her. And I love this shot here of ways in which women mirror and teach the performative modes of kind of womanhood. And I invited a range of individuals to engage with her work. Awala Rezku begins the portfolio section. Steve Nelson has a beautiful piece about this work that's similar in a sense to a Kende Wiley, if you might know his work, but he's inserting into kind of familiar portraits that we know, this kind of Dutch Vermeer shot, subjects who we might not expect to find there with a kind of forcefulness and power. This is, again, from the Afropunk series that I mentioned earlier. Any of which could have been the cover of the issue. So I could continue to take us through, I don't know.
Yes.
Yeah?
More. Yes.
More. So we have a portfolio of many photographers, but I know I wanted to include Toyin Odutola, who's photographically based, but is creating actually paintings or drawings instead that are a way to argue that the Black body has become a landscape in a sense. She's looking topographically at bodies through these ballpoint pen created images done after she photographs her subjects. So she's New York based and quite young.
We go back to the Rankin
Yes,
Claudius quote?
sure, yes. So she renders Blackness as topography while offering it life in the form of figures. I could read a bit more from Claudia's, but Toyin is certainly one to watch, but Claudia Rankin offering to write the piece, I think really amplified its power. Toyin, I should say, she was born in Nigeria, and she's really looking at Blackness, as Claudia puts it, not just as a subject, but as a question. She says, the space of Blackness is itself the subject of her portraits. Historically, Blackness becomes unilaterally a signifier of race, but for Odutola's work, race is there or it is not there. But its presence is never without our perceptions and our projections. And that's so much of what I see with the kind of this, almost like the watermark on the body. It's as if she's instantiating our own perceptions onto these bodies. So I'd encourage you to, of course, if you have the issue, to read Claudia's piece. Each portfolio is accompanied by a very short, sort of 500-word, poetic reading of each image. So these are the rest of the images in the portfolio. Lorna Simpson follows on, and Margot Jefferson wrote the piece there. Viewing a photograph or a collage, you ask, what am I looking at and what for? What am I projecting onto? What's here? And she's referencing these I'm not sure if you can see these well enough, these Jet magazine collaged images where she's included kind of incendiary comments with these sort of more whimsically created portraits of black women. Here, can Birmingham Negroes win the civil rights fight? Where you're looking at this image. And here, the strange sit-in that changed a city. She goes on with these upside down kind of protest images. But I love also the decision to have these images included because in part, she's looking at the way in which self-fashioning and presentation was a political act, right? During the civil rights moment and also after the New Negro period in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s. So Margot's piece is very powerful.
Let's talk more about that, of being a political act. Earlier in the week we discussed, and I'm struggling in the exact context, but we talked about the African American experience of writing being itself a political act.
Yep.
And simply because that was not a premise that was put forward as being appropriate.
Right. And denied.
Yes. I mean, it simply was any form of writing becomes a political act in that lens. And I wonder how that relates to photography and the correction in some ways, I think including these images speaks to that.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it gets to really the heart of the issue here. Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham she's really pioneered this scholarship on the politics of respectability, right? Her argument was really kind of sartorial arrangement, self-fashioning wasn't just a way to assert a kind of dignity on a personal level, but was a way to do so on a political sort of national level during the civil rights movement in particular. Now, if you look at the origins of this moment in which photography was used to try to argue for polygenesis, you see the beginnings of the need for kind of self-fashioning, self-presentation to be part of the corrective move for citizenship. Why is that? Well, when J.T. Zealy was asked by Louis Agassiz to photograph these bare-chested and bare-breasted African and American-born Negroes at the time, right? You see this kind of forcible unrobing happening in the pictures, right? And it's chilling because you see the dresses on the women, the enslaved women pulled down, yanked down so that you can have a better view of their own physiognomy and body, right? And it's haunting and it's chilling, and part of the reason, I believe, for the move to own your own presentation is because of the way in which that denial was so tied with denigration, So Lorna is looking at the extension of this. I think very much, the following portfolio, Annie Leibovitz is looking at the extension of this in terms of self-fashioning. When I just talked about that Zealy image, 150 years later, here we have Susan Rice at the center of the United Nations with the United States in front of her as emblematizing her own power in complete control of her own look. So no, I don't think it's whimsical at all, this, and I don't think that it's actually discussed enough, the way in which self-fashioning and self-presentation is a political act. But for African American life, it absolutely has been, as much as writing has been. I think Chris Jackson was speaking about that the other day. This portfolio is what follows next, and it continues the conversation about self-fashioning.
You wrote about this.
I did.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about why you included this?
So I didn't write about it, but when the New York Times,
Sorry, I was in an interview. You're right.
So the New York Times did, I think it's actually, I now have learned that it's unprecedented what they did. So the cover story for the art section was about this issue, but they also, on the second page, devoted the entire page to the issue, including the photographs, many of which we're showing you today. But what I discussed in the interview, it's a transcript of an interview with me, was why this image was so important to include. It's from Vanity Fair in 2001, and I saw it when I had just graduated from college, actually, at Harvard. And I was living in the UK and ripped it out and put it up on my wall, moved each year, took it with me for subsequent 4 years, because I found it just the aggregate of these models that Iman had curated and put together from, you see Tyra Banks, and you can probably recognize some of the other models, Naomi Campbell, Beverly Johnson, together, the sheer beauty of their image, I thought, was such a good example of the corrective power of photography to offer a counter-narrative to oftentimes more denigrating images of Black women in particular, just historically. So I looked at this, and I was a kid really at the time with this on my dorm room wall, but it became this kind of sort of talismanic image that made me think about whether or not this would become part of my life, whether or not this idea would become part of the work I would do. So it was Annie Leibovitz's image that really, in part, got me to think about this topic more kind of soberly and more deeply. She then, she took my photograph of years ago when this profile came out in Vogue, and I, at the time, realized how few Black women had been in front of her lens. She's so mindful of putting her subjects in a historical continuum. She oftentimes will reference a historical image, whether or not we know it, with the choice of composition. And it occurred to me that even though she's not, and I think for some people were confused as to why I would include her in this issue, she, I think, has done so much for the field of African American photography to a certain degree, right? Mm-hmm. By using her platform and by using her sort of masterful compositions to show and to exalt different stories about Black life.
I can't help but think how striking it is to see in many of the images we're looking at today, but certainly this one, beauty being the form of the corrective.
Yes.
But that masks actually the true ugliness of what you're correcting.
Yes.
It's not polite, perhaps in a way, is the way it can seem. Right. And you must have at certain moments felt the struggle within yourself about how not to be polite about what you're actually correcting.
Yes. No, absolutely. It's a great
I'm thinking
point.
particularly about the president and the levels of hate. Yeah. And the unprecedented, the backlash and all of the things, and the First Lady, all of the issues that you are correcting for in some ways.
Absolutely. Well, I think what saved me from wanting to put those images on the pages too, to offer readers a kind of contrasting sense, is that I'm doing other work in other arenas on those images. The J.T. Zealy images I was telling you about, I'm writing an essay for a book that's coming out about those images. So I felt that the energy was going positively in another direction. But you're right. Beauty is also a political force, and that's part of the work of Deborah Willis, who's, if you don't know her scholarship, well, you probably do if you're in this room. Photo historian at Tisch, another MacArthur-winning great photographer whose works themselves don't often get seen, but she's looked at the role of beauty in shifting these narratives about Black life. But what I haven't said, and I probably should, is the reason why this is so important is, again, for historical reason, the way in which racial categories were placed in a hierarchy, right, in the 19th century was done through beauty and representation, right? It was, so when Douglass was giving this speech, he was at the time following on the very widely popular treatise from the American School of Ethnology that used the Apollo Belvedere as one standard of beauty for whiteness, and used this gaped-mouthed Black man and a chimpanzee as the other extreme, right, to show ugliness and beauty, so beauty and ugliness. So again, the corrective is about beauty. It is about refashioning our notions of beauty. That
narrative, that storytelling arc.
Exactly.
Cutting into it.
Cutting into that arc, precisely. Yeah. And I chose not to use those. I could have certainly, what I just described is illustrated in that 1848 treatise that was, one of the best-selling books in America at the time, that book, right? I chose not to include that, but I certainly will with my students when I teach it. But what are we robbed of when we don't know that history, right? We're robbed of understanding understanding why it is, context, and why that image is so powerful. We know it, I think, on a gut level because it's so rare. But why is it so rare, right?
Absolutely. I want to ask what time it is. I have no idea.
11:02. Oh, it's perfect timing.
So good.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to, we're going to go to questions in a moment.
Sure.
Do you want to scroll through a little bit more? I don't want to make sure we don't leave out anything you want to share.
I think there's one maybe last thing. I'll just scroll through a few more so you can see this is a beautiful Serena shot This is Deborah Willis, who I mentioned a minute ago. Carrie Mae Weems is the subject here. I'll just cycle through a few more, but she's certainly looking at the role of beauty and blackness here. This is a portfolio that was so powerful. I was in tears editing this down. Sally Mann has created a set of sort of wet collodion plate photographs that I think condense almost 150 years of history down to one image, as she's done here. It's as if the middle passage is sort of compositionally imposed upon just this man on a bench, as if he's sort of packed into that hull of the ship. It's so powerful. So these images are included. Jamel Shabazz, if you don't know his work, I hope you explore it. He's a New York-based photographer who's created an Honor and Dignity series and has done so for 30 years. He's known for going up to subjects to give you a sense of this kind of beautiful spirit he has, going up to subjects and saying, I see your greatness. Will you let me photograph it? You know. So he's, through that frame, has created images like this, and like this, and this. Actually,
Sisters.
Yeah, these beautiful sisters here. Devin Allen came to prominence when Time magazine put him on the cover after Ferguson. He's Baltimore-based, and he has been able to really, almost like a Gordon Parks, document the movement, the emerging Black Lives Matter movement and others. This was what the New York Times chose for the front of the art section. There are also abstract photographers like Leslie Hewitt included here, who's really combing her own archive to consider the role of pictures in the civil rights movement. Just show you a few more. Lyle Ashton Harris, who's engaging with the same 19th century portrait tradition we were talking about earlier, and showing us individuals forcefully through it, like Anthony Appiah here, or Kara Walker, the back side too, Renee Cox, John Singleton, Anna DeVere Smith, Thelma. And I wanted to end with, and we could continue going, with Rudy Roy's images. Now, the platform of social media has given him a huge audience. I think he has like 200,000 followers or something, but he's not shown in galleries, et cetera. But he has this great series in which he's looking at the way in which walking through the world conveys an idea of dignity that he photographs. And Garnett Cadigan wrote a beautiful piece about his work, which I'm showing you here. So I guess I'll end with perhaps this image, which I think is so strong as a way to show dignity, compassion, care, and honor between citizens, captured by a powerful photographer.
Wow, beautiful, Sarah.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Okay, so we have a mic. If you raise hands, we will bring the mic to you. I'm going to start with the gentleman right in the back, and then we'll work our way forward.
Hi, I'm Khan. Thank you for putting together such a powerful and beautiful piece. That's a great resource. I grew up in an Asian American immigrant community, and my parents, weren't exposed and didn't know the history of Black history. So I think for me, I would love to get your insights on what tools or suggestions can you give me to share these types of resources to my mom, my dad, my aunts who don't know and have that perspective or that shared perspective. If I'm being really candid, like my concern is that they probably have a more racist perspective than that would be appropriate because they aren't exposed to and have not had that relationship or history with African American history.
Yes.
Thank you.
No, thank you. It's a great question, and it's a challenging question because you have pinpointed the reason for the urgency of this issue, right? I wish I could tell you, go to this website, and you will, on this site, find everything you need to understand the corrective move that we're trying to offer with new images of Black life and all the stereotypes that you need to see so you understand the reason for doing this. But there isn't one, right? So it's incumbent upon us. What I can do is direct you to pioneering scholars and pioneering photographers who are doing this work. But I think part of the reason why the Times did what they did, doing the 2 pages, right, when they'd never done that before, is because they realized that there isn't a place to look at these corrective images, and they wanted to just give over space to the readers to do that.
I felt that too when you told me that, and you also, when I saw that it was published internationally as well in the same format,
That's right,
that they seized an opportunity because it's so necessary.
It's so necessary.
And even if you just take it down to the level of Aperture itself,
Yes.
they realized we need to do this.
That's right, and they're Aperture. They're the main body that's sort of publishing these incredible books of our landmark photographers, and they realized they needed to do this. But I'd love to speak to you afterwards, to say, because I take this question very seriously. It's why this is my life's work. I mean, looking at the work of Skip Gates, making sure that you understand Deborah Willis's scholarship, looking at everything that Carrie Mae Weems does, or any of these photographers, will give you a more critical lens on the images that come to us in media of all kinds. I think we need to be able, part of the reason for this issue, I think, having a broader audience than the art world alone, is because we need to be able to all understand the corrective moves that these photographers are making as we, as global citizens, just engage with the stream of images that come around us. So I'm not sure where you're based or what you do, but I'm a resource for you as well. So I want to make sure you know that. But it's a great question, and it's why I think the course I decided to teach at Harvard in the fall, the first course, is on this topic, on vision and justice. I also decided to not make it a seminar and make it a lecture instead, which we'll probably disseminate in other ways, sort of through technology, because I do realize there is not one place to look at the entire arc of the role of representation for shifting notions of citizenship, right? You can kind of get snippets of it and address it in one particular way or another. But there are very few people even knew about Douglass's speech, before we started to talk about it through the pages of this issue, through a book that's come out that's really an academic book called Pictures in Progress on Duke University Press. And it's been languishing in the Library of Congress for 150 years, digitized there. You can see his handwriting and everything. But it's a very recent development, so I'm happy to be part of it, and I want to do all that I can to disseminate it.
I think that Deborah Willis's book, which you described as growing up on your table, that you'd flip through and put yourself in the continuum in some way, shape, or form.
That's right.
And I'd also add to that Winton's speech when he got the Marian Anderson Award, which we use here for young artist seminars, discussing being born perpetually midstream, bears to that idea that there is this midstream and how to place ourselves. But
I love that. No, and I should add, no, you're right. The stream idea is important because it's also a metaphor for what it is, this idea of nourishment and making sure that we're surrounded, by these things. So Deborah Willis's book was In My Childhood Home. She's published, 26 books, right, of African American photography. She is, this is what won her the MacArthur. But when I was a child, I had these images of my great-grandparents and others. And what I talked about in the New York Times piece was how I realized at a young age how rare that was, because we had a flood in our home, and a neighbor came by. We lived in this all-white community. Neighbor came by to try to help with the flood, and she walked into our home and stopped herself, not because of the water, but because she was so struck by seeing these images of African Americans at the time period, my great-great-grandparents. And she said to my mother, even I don't have images of my own great-great-grandparents. And I was 8 or 9 at the time, but I remember that moment as clear as day to this day. And I, at that moment, realized that there was something in those images that was rare and that pointed to the need for me to explore and understand their significance. But Deborah Willis's book being there gave me a place to go, a resource for myself to understand why that encounter occurred the way that it did, what force they really did have, So I don't know, other people Winton has other examples that put him midstream. For me, it was Deborah Willis, and I think many other historians would say the same. Her work really has been the locus that's offered the context for the importance of understanding the role of representation in photography for American culture and Black life.
another question.
Yeah.
Mike's coming to you. And you can tell us who you are, too.
Howard Herring. from the New World Symphony in Miami Beach. We work with a high school, Northwestern Senior High School, half black, half Haitian. And we do this on music basis. And we've done it for 10 years. We're very much a part of their world. They're a part of ours. And it's a wonderful thing. And I look at these images, and from all of my conversations with these high school kids, I see how this is going to give them an understanding of themselves that I don't think they have. So I'm talking about urgency. I'm talking about dissemination here. How is what we just experienced, how can I get that to that school, or how can it travel beyond where you've already published? Have you thought about that?
Sure. Just to clarify the question, so practically speaking, where can they get their hands on it? Yeah.
How do we get it to them?
So Amazon, right now, it's actually #1 bestseller on Amazon.com in terms of the photography books they have. So you can go right there. It's on track to sell out, so we're doing a second printing of it. But Aperture.org is the organization where you can also buy it just directly. It's sold in Barnes & Nobles too, in fact, and on newsstands. So you can buy it there. And online you can see, so that if you don't have the resources, or the students don't have the resources to actually buy it, I asked Aperture to make the entirety of the issue available online so they can look at the portfolios.
It's all there.
It's all there.
And then, as you said, it sounds like coming out of your first semesters at Harvard, there will be a lecture of sorts that could be, part of a curriculum even, and I would recommend that automatically. Just say that's first step.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to make the course really modular so that even in, say, the introductory lecture, you're able to understand this full arc, right? So you don't have to take the whole class to get it. Because I do think it's important. Harvard students are going to be lucky to be able to engage with it for a whole semester, but it's so urgent, I think, for our nation right now to understand it, especially given the role of social conflict that's being just pumped into kind of our homes and our media constantly without these corrective images to counterbalance.
Yeah, one sec, sorry, you'll be next. That's such an interesting point. The corrective itself, in the framework of a society that is increasingly segmented into we only hear what we want to hear.
That's right.
So I'm wondering about how to counteract that. In that sense, the Obama administration has been a massive corrective of sorts because it's simply present. There's no way around it. But it also, as we have discussed, had tremendous backlashes and things that, I just wonder how much you've thought about that, because there are issues of wide-scale dissemination, and then there's issues of intimacy about how one can commune with it. But that's reaching the audiences that are closed.
That, I started to think about this when the LA Times did this, the kind of review that you don't even think you could get about the Aperture issue, this sort of panegyric praise, about the issue. And I looked for the first time at the comments section. Never look at the comments section. And apparently it was dominated by white supremacists from Stormfront. All upset, essentially. Why did that happen? Because actually Ava DuVernay and Bradford Young had included the word white supremacist frame in I guess the keyword search resulted in them all finding the article. And I thought, this is fascinating, but actually this is fantastic. This is fantastic. So in part, I think the agitational role, and this gets back to Baldwin, I think of an image or of an artist's work can create that bridge.
That's right.
So I want to continue to do this work and not just simply put it in places where you have those who understand the message. I want it to be in front of those who don't and who need to.
That's right. Right here, Mike, coming to you.
This is just a quick question. So is your Harvard course going to be on, are there Coursera? I forget what their MOOC is, but is that what it'll be on? Or is
I hope so. It's the first time I'll be teaching it, so we need to determine how they'll then, in the subsequent year, let it go into the world. But that is my hope. Yeah.
Anybody else, just raise your hand. Otherwise,
Sarah,
Heather?
Yes.
I feel like maybe I'll say it not correctly.
No.
But what is the impact of tokenism, say Tyson in the Ralph Lauren ads?
Interesting.
How does that help? How does that feel? Is it important?
So the question is, for anybody who couldn't hear, was, what is the place of tokenism in this conversation? For instance, the male model Tyson was featured heavily in Ralph Lauren ads for many years. And I think Thelma spoke to this slightly in the panel the other day about gatekeepers and where she stood as a African American woman leading a museum, asked to do everything and be the representative in every circumstance.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
Maybe you could comment on that.
Sure. No, and I do feel that too. I think as one of the few African American professors at Harvard, my inbox is on fire. I mean, all the time. I realize now. I didn't anticipate that. This is a great question. I think part of the reason why I wanted to offer a kind of sort of multiple senses and different narratives about Black life, such that you have a range of kind of photographic practices, right? And it is because of the way in which tokenism kind of overburdens a Black body to perform the function, the corrective function. Exactly, for everyone, right? This is why I think Claudia Rankin's piece on Toyin is so important, because it speaks to this point. Actually, the way in which Claudia is looking at the body as a kind of topography is really looking at the more insidious kind of functions of tokenism. It's you essentially are mining that one body as almost like you're a car going over land for everything that you need to feel and find about that Black experience. And no one body can withstand that, ultimately. And it also cauterizes the full scope of the human lives lived in Black skin in many different forms that aren't represented by a Tyson or by an image that we're using as representative. So part of the hope with this, and it's why it's about far more than African American identity, is to really understand how it is the pictures that can give us a fuller sense of the broader lived lives of humanity writ large, right? Through different narratives that we offer. So I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
We're gonna stop in a minute, but I would just maybe we could close on that note about telling stories in that way. So you described in some of the writing about the creating an internal portrait gallery. So we all do this, and we carry these images with us, and that creates our own narratives that we see. And you have in this other phrase I wanted to bring in quickly was representational justice.
Yes.
That you create a sense of representational justice within our internal portrait galleries, and yet and that makes it an intimate experience as well.
Yes.
So
Yes.
maybe we could bring it back to maybe your personal sense of creation. How we curate for ourselves. You're a curator. You've curated this.
Yeah.
Your hopes in some ways about how people approach the work.
Well,
It's a lot. Sorry.
no, it's great. Yeah, it's a great way to end, because I think what I hope with this issue is that it encourages us all to be more mindful of the diet that we have in our lives to do with representation, mindful of that because we know, I think, and this is what Douglass was arguing quite literally in the speech, that we are internally like picture galleries. That is how we fashion our worlds. That is the filter through which we see the world in front of us. This has fatal consequences when it comes to issues like racial profiling, right? Like you see the lived realities, the consequences of not recognizing the role of these thought pictures, as Douglass would call them, as we deal with citizens moving around the world. So my hope is that this inspires people to seek out other ways of seeing the other, right? So that we can have a more fully representational kind of internal picture gallery. The word representational justice is what I am using to describe this corrective move. Justice, why? Because I think it offers a fuller sense of humanity, to be able to not only have in our mind's eye those stereotypical images that inspired Douglass and everyone else to really think through what we could do to offer a truer picture, a truer portrait of how people are actually living on American soil. So storytelling, I think, is such a dominant theme at Aspen, and I love being able to engage with that, because it's also a way of kind of democratizing or de-skilling, in a sense, people's ability to access this idea. We're all telling stories in many different ways. Like, there are so many cultural narratives that we're putting forward, and these photographers, I think, work is often seen just in the art world, in galleries and fantastic museums and exhibition catalogs, but I hope they become the stories that actually populate your own hearts and minds too, and that we can increasingly, find ways to bridge the gulfs that are between us more and more, as sociologists tell us, through these portraits, through representational justice, ultimately. So,
Bravo. Thank you so much.
thank you, Damian.